If you've watched even one photography video, you've heard someone say photography is about chasing light. Partly true. That is one of the things photography is about. But one thing I find is that people in their abilities in trying to figure out photography, because our phones can magically adjust and find the distance between the darkness and the light and bring everything up to a level that everything looks pleasing, when you switch to using your first camera, your first real camera, what happens is you don't know what the settings are about. Now, there's a few ways through this. You could set your camera on auto and call it a day. You can say, auto's good. I'm just going to stay on auto. It's good for me. That's fine. You're not some kind of weird failure when you set it to auto. But if you want to learn a little bit about it, you can learn about something called the exposure triangle. There's only 3 parts to it because that's why it's a triangle. First, aperture. Aperture is how wide the lens gets when you look through it. Let's see, maybe I can show you on this one. I will turn this wide open. You can almost see through it, see? Woo! That's aperture, and then as you close it down, the aperture gets smaller. Well, that means how much light are you letting into the lens? That's aperture. What that does, though, is if you have it wide open like that, because you probably would think in your head somewhere, well, that's what I should do all the time. It should be wide open. I should be able to get the most possible light in it as I can. In bright, bright daylight, that's a problem. Without some kind of a filter on the front of this, it's going to be hard because you're going to let too much light in and you're going to snow out your whole shot. If you turn it way too far the other way and it's darkness, you're not going to get enough light in. Well, why do people have an aperture? What does this even do? It manages something called depth of field. So if you open it wide, what you're saying is, it's okay if the background is blurry. I just want to focus on the thing I want to focus on. You can use this to make dreamy photos. I've said that many times. That's what aperture is about. It controls how much light is in, and it controls how much depth of field. Let me put this back on without breaking anything. Okay. That's aperture. Then there's shutter. Now, shutter is when you push the camera button and when you are shooting a photo, shutter is what allows the little window to open and close. So I'll show you. This is the shutter. Let's see, can you see that? Yeah, you can see it there. So this is the shutter. When I turn open my camera, see, ooh, the sensor's open. You're not really supposed to do this. And then you push the button, there's the shutter. That's how shutters work. And so the shutter, what that does is how long are you allowing light to get in? That's what a shutter does. So I've got aperture, which is depth of field. I've got aperture, which is, how do I let so much light in? I have shutter. How much time do I allow that to stay open to see how much light is going to be locked into the shot? If you go slow on your shutter, low shutter, like if you make it 60 or even, 60 milliseconds or whatever. If you do this, letting more light in over more amount of time, but it also can allow blur. So there's times when if you do really slow shutter or wide open shutter or kind of like long exposure, you can use shutter as a way to make a shot more interesting because you make the blur into part of the shot. But if it's nighttime out and your aperture isn't cutting it and you have to open up your shutter and try to make it go lower, lower, lower so it's slow, you're going to make things jostly. And when you make them jostly, you're going to make them blurry, especially if you're handheld and you're not using a tripod. If you got a tripod, you might save yourself a little bit, but it's not guaranteed. That's the second part of the triangle. So you got aperture and you got shutter. The third one is ISO. Now, in the old days, ISO. In the old days, what that was for is different film stock had different tolerances for how much light it needed to be exposed. And so in film days, it meant something a slight bit different. What it means now, I think of it as sort of MSG. You could put a little ISO on your photo and it's going to spice it up. It's going to raise the light up a little bit. If you put a lot of MSG, you're going to taste nothing but salt, right? And if you do that, it's going to be a whole different kind of picture. It makes it way too grainy. Too much ISO can make it feel blurry. This is the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter, ISO. If you satisfy the first two, aperture and shutter, you will have a range within which the ISO can make up the difference. So if it gets a little darker, if you suddenly are in a spot where you're shooting something where you need to make it brighter than it is in real life, you can only open the aperture so far if you want to get a lot of the shot in focus. If you are shooting something that's moving around, you can only let the shutter go so slow before it's going to introduce blur. So you're either not going to have depth of field, or you're going to have blur with your aperture and your shutter. And then the third one, ISO, in digital cameras for sure, makes up for the difference. So you can cheat a little. You can say, I need to see as much in focus as I can. I want to see the mountains in the background. I want to see the person standing there next to the street light, and I want to see these bushes in the foreground. I want everything in focus as best as I can. You might make that f8 on your aperture. If you are like, and I know it's kind of getting late, I know the sun's going to go down, but I'm going to catch that golden hour, it's going to be bright, then you might make your shutter somewhere between 250 or maybe 500 if it's super bright. And you can go down to 125, maybe 100. Right below that, just your regular body movement is going to make it a little bit blurry or risk it being blurry. And what you can do, especially on digital cameras, especially as you get a little more pro of a camera, you can set ranges to these things. You can say, I want my ISO to be between this and this. That's the exposure triangle, and I'm going to start throwing some caveats out there that will help you. One is to note that most modern software that edits photos has AI denoising technology, such that you can let the ISO go crazy high. And if you shoot with RAW as your style of photo output, instead of just straight JPEG, if you shoot RAW, you can have the ISO go really high, and AI denoising goes, psh, don't worry about it. I know what these pixels should look like, and it makes it look a little bit better. Usually a lot bit better. I run a lot of my nighttime photos through AI denoising, and it exists on multiple softwares. You could use it, Adobe Lightroom. You can do Luminar Neo. You could do Photomator if you're a Mac user. There's many. Raw Therapy, Darktable. There's all kinds. That is one of your caveats, is that you can let ISO go high because most modern editing software can fix that a little bit. Now that you know that aperture is one of the ways that you can get things, to open up and get lighter, the bigger the aperture open that you can have, like if you could set it to something like f2.8 or maybe f2, maybe you could get as, somewhere towards whatever. If you can control your aperture a little bit, then you don't have to rely so much on the shutter. You don't have to rely so much on the ISO as well. You can have minimum and maximum ISO if you want. You could say, I never want it to go over whatever you think the number is, 5,600 or something. Mine, I let it go all the way up to 12,800. Why? Because afterwards I can fix it if I have to, and I just try never to get it there. A lot of people have these rules that don't help anybody, that say things like you should never let your ISO be anything but 100. Well, great, except you're going to miss some shots that way. Here's the other detail of doing this. So that's called the exposure triangle. You have to shoot to that. As you are taking photographs, you have to learn through a few different ways. There's technology on board your camera that lets you understand if this is too dark or too bright, right in real time if you want. It'll say to you that it's anywhere, like the exposure compensation might say, or histogram might say. You might see a whole graphic if you want on your little focusing screen that tells you, wow, this is a lot more towards the dark than it is towards the light. It brings you to one more detail, which is to say that as you work with photos more and more, it's almost always, if you're going to edit, like if you're not going to shoot straight out of the camera, if you're shooting straight out of the camera with JPEGs, you've got to shoot in a way that it's going to be a pleasing shot right away. You have to have the exposure more or less right. You can cheat a little bit with if you're editing after the fact with RAW. If you underexpose to preserve your sky, a lot of times that works a little bit better than the other way around. I was going to show you, neither of my cameras have a dedicated exposure dial that shows the actual numbers on it. But I was going to say there's some settings you can do where you have exposure compensation. And that's the camera's way of saying, I'll take care of some of this stuff for you. But if you're shooting a manual, it's pretty important to know what I just walked you through about the exposure triangle. That's my lesson for today. It's a right down the middle lesson. But you know why I wanted to do this? There are all kinds of people who have these like notepads of what they think the settings should be, and they just match the settings and they go out and they shoot. That's not how it works. I mean, look, you can do it in a lot of different ways, but you don't have magic settings. It's not like a recipe as such. It's more like jazz. You got to kind of go out and feel what the light is doing. You got to connect to the light. If it's a little dark, you can put stuff up. If it's a little bright out, you got to notch it down. You might need filters on the front to protect your lens. If it's, a polarizing filter or something where it's going to knock the density out a little bit so you can get it darker. There's so many ways to approach this. And it's to be approached. This is important to follow and learn and pay attention to and absorb. But that's why I figured I'll show you the triangle, right? If you get the triangle, you're ahead of the game on a lot of people who are shooting, and you can start to practice it. We can talk some other time about, for instance, try to shoot someone either fully in the dark or fully in the light, because if you don't, you're going to have a problem matching these kinds of things. What does high contrast photography look like versus not? How do you shoot on a super bright, super intense sunny day? We have lots of stuff we could cover if you want. But I figured, when you finally get that shot to use your first real camera, you might as well know some of the details that are hidden in auto and see if it's helpful to you. Chris at chrisbrogan.com. Ask any questions, ask any follow-up, leave comments. I love comments. Thanks so much for taking a look. And you know what I'm going to say? Be good to yourself.